It's Oklahoma, so we've got to say always confident, but maybe a little bit more extra confident here in 2021. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Sooners. We do so with Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. And we're going to break down spring practice with, of course, the spring game coming up in a couple of weeks. Jason, how are we doing today?
Great, Mark. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
I am doing just fine. Please share the videos out on social media and subscribe right here. So we know when the spring game is. We've got that nailed down now. That would be, I wrote it down right here. April 17th.
April 24th.
24th. I already forgot. April 24th at 4 p.m. Central Time.
That's right.
I remembered that part of it. All right, Jason. Thank you for those details. Then let's see to the offensive side of the ball. A lot of the key offensive contributors met with the media this week and position coaches as well. What were you able to take from some of those conversations?
Yeah, I think, Mark, one of the biggest and really the kind of the longest transcript that there was with some of the offensive coaches was really with offensive line coach Bill Bedenbaugh. Really, one of the areas where Oklahoma underachieved just a bit in 2020, just in terms of what they were expected to do, coming into the season. So Bill Bedenbaugh has talked a little bit about this, and it looks like there's been a fairly significant mental, I guess, a mental attitude coming into the spring ball versus where they were at in fall. They were a little heavy on the offensive line, especially at the guard position. Some of the kids came in a little bit overweight, as not incredibly overweight, but not exactly where he would have liked them to be. And so they've made a big change to slim down a little bit here in the spring of 2021. So he in talking with him, he was very, very excited about some of those kids and how they've come into 2021, just kind of a different attitude, so to speak. So I think one of the guys that he talked a lot about was Andrew Reim. He will be a sophomore this year out of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Really highly recruited, 4-star guy, according to 247, was a guy that was really talented coming in. And Bedenbaugh talked a little bit about him. He was a guy that, he was out a couple of times with contact tracing, and then he got COVID himself once. So he had he missed several spurts of time of the season for Oklahoma, and Bedenbaugh still talked about he had the opportunity to start as a true freshman. So shows some of the talent that he has. He's had a really, really good spring. Talked about him a lot as a guy that could make some waves, and he's a guy that's going to be battling against two guys at the guard position that are seniors. Tyreese Robinson and Marquis have played a lot of ball for Oklahoma on the offensive line, and so talked a lot about them. Anton Harrison is a guy who played at the tackle position for Oklahoma last year, slimmed down a little bit. Maybe slimmed down a little bit too much, according to Bedenbaugh, but has really turned the corner from a mental aspect, and really that's the biggest thing for some of these kids coming in as newer offensive linemen, is really being in a position to be able to catch things up mentally. Bedenbaugh also talked a little bit about the center position. I think from all intents and purposes, you can pretty much, unless something crazy happens, they're very much pushing Chris Murray, which is the transfer from UCLA, played a little bit last year. He'll be there in that starting spot in the center position. He seems to be pretty focused on that. Reading between the lines, it would be surprising to see really anyone else. And then, kind of moving on to some of the other positions within the offense, a couple of guys that were talked about in terms of the running back position, Marcus Major and Eric Gray. We talked a little bit last week about Seth McGowan, and Spencer Rattler was very complimentary of him on the talking about Seth McGowan just in terms of his prowess in the weight room. But I think one of the guys who might be separating himself a little bit right now is Eric Gray, the transfer from Tennessee, just in terms of what he's able to do all around, just from all aspects of the running back position, being able to pick up the blitzes from a blocking perspective, a wide receiver out of the backfield at that running back position, and just the time that he has, the experience that he has as well. Marcus Major is a guy that Lincoln Riley also was very, very complimentary of. So I would say right now, from a pecking order perspective, those two guys might be your leaders right now. Kind of looking at how things are going. Kennedy Brooks was talked to a little bit as well. Really just marking it in terms of, really his decision last year was really kind of poignant, talking about, he just him and his family didn't know a whole lot about COVID. And quite frankly, they were scared of the uncertainty. And that was a big reason and why he decided to opt out. So, given the fact that, he's been out for a year, I think it's taking him a little bit longer to kind of get into game shape and really kind of getting back into the flow of things. So he may lag behind a little bit here in the spring, but certainly expect him to get back in there. I think the one good thing about the running back room for Oklahoma here, Mark, is that they do have four guys that they feel pretty comfortable with that could play a significant amount of minutes and a lot of carries and play a lot for them. Riley typically, will settle in a couple, maybe three guys that play. When it comes to conference season, you'll probably have two guys that play majority of the time, and then you'll have another guy that will spell them. So. That's looking promising, I think, from the Oklahoma side. And I think one of the last area that we'll talk through here from a wide receiver perspective is really a position that Riley talked about that underachieved fairly significantly in 2020, according to him. Had 7 drops. Spencer Rattler had 7 wide receiver drops for touchdowns, which led the country last season. So it's almost kind of a put up or shut up season for that wide receiver group. Marvin Mims has played incredibly well over the first couple of weeks in spring, and there's a couple of other guys that are starting to make some plays and starting to. I think they're taking that criticism and they're taking that challenge as a personal challenge for them to. To step up. Jaden Hazelwood, Trajan Bridges are a couple of guys, very ballyhooed recruits, both 5-star guys, really haven't made much of an impact as much as they would have anticipated at this year, really kind of being their junior season here at Oklahoma. Both of those have had by all points are indicating that they've had a really good spring, really stepping up, being the consistent kids that they really need to be. Specifically Bridges with his trouble over the last couple of years. So those are a couple of guys. And then from a true freshman perspective, Mario Williams is a guy that's really been called out as someone who looks the part, even as a true freshman. Very obviously another guy that's really highly recruited, highly thought of coming out of Florida from a wide receiver position perspective. And he's made a lot of plays, and he's a guy that it looks like it right now, if he continues to progress, a guy that they can count on to play a decent amount. So those 4 guys among the wide receiver group seem to be separating themselves a little bit at this point early on in the spring.
Yeah, it speaks to the situation with Kennedy Brooks missing that time. It also speaks to the talent in front of him when you've got a 1,000-yard rusher who's not necessarily just going to be, bam, reinserted, you're number 1, there you go. Missing that time has brought him back a little bit. But again, as you mentioned, it's a spring session in which players get back acclimated and learn things, even if they played the previous season. And then you get to summer camp and he should be fine. He's played a ton of football. The absence of Creed Humphrey, we've talked about it in the past, I think is fascinating from the standpoint that the offensive line, again, as we go over from time to time, is the most the unit in most need of cohesiveness and coordination. And then you take away a player, and usually we're just talking about the talent void. But with him, we're talking about the knowledge void. We're talking about the leadership void. And he was just a very valuable player. And so they have capable people to step in. But there's almost an intangible there that can't be accounted for until you get the guys together and the bullets start to fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, Mark. When you look at the totality of this roster coming into 2021, and the pieces that they need to replace, certainly there's there at the center position. There's some things on the defensive side of the ball, on the cornerback side, the secondary. But the center, to me, is probably the biggest. Not that I would say a concern but is the biggest area that they need someone to step up and be that guy. And listening to Bill Bedenbaugh, listening to Lincoln Riley, it looks like Chris Murray will be that guy. It seems like they're laying pretty much all of their cards really in that deck. Not necessarily that there's other kids not working there. Nate Anderson is a guy who was a true freshman last year who's getting some time. There's another kid named Ian MacGyver who's played a little bit. He's been in a backup role to Creed Humphrey. He's not quite as talented, not quite as physical as the other kids. So there's a couple of people that are working it, but Chris Murray is the guy that they think is. And Bill Beanville likes to move his kids around a lot on the offensive line side of the ball, I should say. Specifically during spring, he likes to put people in different positions, see what works. He's been quoted as saying several times he doesn't necessarily look for the 5 best. He looks for the 5 best that work together the best in terms of your point on cohesiveness. So I think Murray is a guy who is strictly working center. Last year he played guard for Oklahoma a little bit. So I think he's strictly works center, through the off season and now in spring ball. He'll continue to do that through, and talked a little bit about a lot of fans in the interview with Chris Murray this week. A lot of fans, think that, gosh, we're what, 5 months away from football actually kicking off, but it's not a long time from his perspective because he's got to do a lot of things on the mental side of things and just just cohesively with the unit to gel and really kind of looking at that from a mental aspect as well, because the center, as the center position certainly is the quarterback around on the offensive line.
I only know this because somebody mentioned this to me yesterday, Jason. 155 days till September 4th and opening day. So you've got the official count right there.
Yeah.
All right. Get your free Oklahoma mask at voiceofcollegefootball.com. We've got 35 teams available, including, of course, the Sooners. So you can get your mask there for free. You get 20% off your first purchase if you so choose, and entered into a $25 gift card giveaway. Jason Ray, last word on college football, breaking down the Sooners with us each and every week. We've looked at the offense. We've looked at recent news there and conversations that have been had. So you talked about this with me before we started to record, and it's a great point to make that we're football fans. We analyze the games, the players, but we almost treat it like a video game at times in terms of these not necessarily being human beings and thinking about that part of it. Just what are their stats? How did they play on Saturday? They're human beings, and they're young men that have to deal with this pandemic situation just like the rest of us. But what was asked of them was beyond what has been asked of most of us in regards to the daily testing, the protocols, and just changing their lives for the good of the team and the guy standing next to them in the locker room. So they opened up, some of them, about their experience this week, and just some of your thoughts about what you heard.
Yeah, they did. And Mark, I think that point is very, very well taken. I think, for the normal person, we don't necessarily, maybe we understand, or maybe we realize what what some of these kids went through, but maybe we don't truly understand really the fact of the matter throughout the season. And this is, before the actual season even started, when they started their summer fall camp, each one of these kids were tested 3 times a week. Any of us that have been tested know it's not a fun process to go through just in itself as a normal person, but these kids being tested 3 times a week and really not knowing from one day to the next whether or not they would get to practice, they get to play, would they test positive, would they get popped for contact tracing, which happened, several times throughout the year for some of these kids. So I think a lot of the kids coming out of it really, I think really appreciate where we're headed, as a nation overall in the fight against this pandemic. So, and I think it was really, really interesting hearing their thoughts on exactly how tough that was. And certainly this isn't specific to Oklahoma. All of the kids that played throughout the country, had to deal with this. And we saw this at the end of the year, right, with some of these teams opting out of bowl games and just really didn't want to have to go through those protocols for an extra 2-3 weeks to be able to play in a bowl game. So, hats off to all these kids who have, in Oklahoma had 3 or 4 kids that opted out. There wasn't a ton of people that opted out throughout, the totality of the season. There was some, obviously, but maybe not as much as some people have thought there would be. So, really hats off to these kids. And a lot of kids are talking about the vaccine. They want to, really want to get the vaccine just so they can return to some sort of normal life as a college student. A lot of these kids, they weren't really allowed to do anything. They were, they were within the program. They practiced. They were with the team. They had to stay with that team. They didn't get to see their family. Didn't get to, get to do things that normal college kids would get to do. So I think it was, really kind of refreshing just to see how excited and their voice inflection and just the attitudes and talking about the opportunity to have a normal, have somewhat of a normal season and and really be in a position to play a little bit more typically. And I think one thing that Riley talked about is in spring, in a typical spring practice, you have 10 practices and you're kind of done. You're ready to because it's not you still got, to our point that we made earlier, you got so many days left until the season actually starts. But now they had talked about, like, I think some of these kids and some of these coaches, they can have 25 or 30 practices, and it wouldn't necessarily be enough. Not in terms of just they needing it, but just really the excitement of getting back out there and going through the process of getting better in spring and knowing who you got, and then carrying that over into the summer conditioning and then certainly fall practice. So I think it's interesting where we're headed as a country, just not even talking about athletics, but is in a good space to where we'll have maybe some sort of a normal college football season this year for not only the fans, but the kids playing the game as well.
That's our hope. We'll still let everyone know you get your free mask at voiceofcollegefootball.com right there. And even if you don't want a mask, just check out the site, help us build the channel. Just check out what we've got there at voiceofcollegefootball.com. We launched about 6 weeks ago, but we're going to have much more delivered there in future days. But you can sign up for free, register for free, get your coupon code, your free mask, your 20% off if you so choose, and a $25 gift card if you win the entry. All right, we got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. The last thing I'll hit you with is another point of discussion that you brought to the table before we started to record, and that's when I bring this up, a lot of people are going to say they're Oklahoma. Of course, they're confident. They've got elite athletes all over the place. They've got one of the best coaches in college football, experienced staff. They know what they're doing. They're Oklahoma. Of course, they're confident. They've owned the Big 12 for 6 years and, in a sense, going on like 20-some years. But at the same time, there's something that you sense and other people sense in just a different level of confidence.
Yeah, I think that's the case, Mark. It's kind of to your point, it's a kind of an interesting discussion because, yes, they've owned the Big 12 over the last 5, 6, 10 years, however you want to put it. They've had to have so many, consecutive championships in the Big 12. So, they've kind of been patted on the back as far as that goes. Then when you look at it nationally, there's this dark cloud that's hanging over the program right now, not being able to win the playoff game. Or, it's been 20 years since Oklahoma has won, 21 years actually since Oklahoma's won a national championship. And they've been there a few times. They've been there in 2003 against LSU, lost. They were there in 2004 against USC and lost. There in 2008 against Florida, national championship game is lost. And then certainly the 3 consecutive playoff appearances and lost in the semifinals in all 3 of those games. So I think Oklahoma going into last year, no matter if the pandemic was going on, I think, most people inside the program and most people kind of looking at that program knew that this was a team that was probably a year or 2 away, given the youth that they had on the offensive side of the ball. And then defensively, still just kind of in year 2 of Grinch's, stint as defensive coordinator. This year, the conversation appears to be a little bit different, really on both sides of the ball. We've talked obviously today a lot about on the offensive side of the ball, but there's just a different tone to the conversation. It seems like, Mark, a lot of times in previous years you'd be looking at whether it be maybe the linebackers or the secondary or, the offensive line or whatever it may be, coaches are kind of looking for those players to step up. Now, from a depth perspective, it's a little bit different, on both sides of the ball, and there's not really as much concern about depth. In a lot of positions, Oklahoma is really solid, going 3 deep and being comfortable, whether it be the defensive line, whether it be the receivers, whether it be the secondary, whatever that discussion point might be. The depth is there. The quality depth is there. Really, it's more about finding those guys that have separated themselves maybe a little bit more than the others. So I think Oklahoma knows that, certainly this is the year. The kids know, the coaches know, anybody surrounding the program. I don't know that this is necessarily, if it's not this year, when is it going to be? But it looks like this is set up in such a way for Oklahoma to make a run this year. So I think barring just a wholesale of injuries or something that's not, that is not foreseen, if this team at the very least doesn't make it to the playoffs, it'll be a pretty big disappointing year. And certainly when they get there, they need to be in a position to be able to win that game. And they, on paper right now, we'll see how things go, obviously throughout the spring and then early on in the fall. But this team on paper has every chance, every opportunity, and should, win a playoff game. Certainly once you get to the playoffs, you got to have the ball maybe bounce your way a couple of times, and you have to have breaks, and matchups are good. But I think when you look at Oklahoma's roster this year, who may be gone next year, specifically when you think about the defensive line, and then you think about some of these other teams that they're going to be competing against from a playoff spot. You look at Georgia, you look at Ohio State, you look at Alabama, you look at Clemson, you look at some of those teams, maybe even the Notre Dame if they get back into there this year. Every team has maybe a little bit of question marks that Oklahoma necessarily wouldn't. Oklahoma went into last year with Spencer Rattler. Yes, he was highly recruited, but how good of a quarterback would he be? Alabama is going to be answering the same questions this year with Bryce Young. I think a couple of times we talked about Ohio State. They don't have I believe you had mentioned they don't have a kid who's taken a meaningful snap at the quarterback position, coming into this year. Clemson, coming in with DJ, he's a little bit more seasoned, played a decent amount last year. So he's probably the lowest, in terms of question marks, at that position as well. Georgia came in, JT Daniels played really, really well towards the end of the year, but then you have the ACL injury to George Pickens that happened earlier. That's a big blow for them. So, when you look at all of these things kind of surrounding them across the country, even Texas, when you think about Texas, just from a conference perspective, they've had to miss a good week of spring practice. Like, all of these things seem to be pointing in the direction that Oklahoma has that opportunity to definitely win a national championship, at the very least win that first playoff game to kind of get that monkey off their back.
I will remind Big 12 fans that Iowa State may have something to say about it, just because while their roster 1 to 100 doesn't compare to Oklahoma's, all those stars are back on offense and defense for Iowa State: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, all conference players. And then Mike Rose on defense. They look in really good shape. And of course, Matt Campbell's one of the best in the business. So that could be, again, a big challenge for the Sooners right there.
And I think it will be. I think you look at Iowa State. Yeah, to your point, everybody's back on offense. I think they're returning 10 of 11 starters, if I remember correctly. There was a few kids that elected to come back for their bonus senior year this year. So I think they will be legitimate top 10. Texas may be top 10, but it's probably more on kind of reputation more than anything. But Iowa State will be legitimate top 10 and really has an opportunity, that they have an early game against Iowa. If they can win that game and avoid the inexplicable loss that they typically see early in the year to a team that they're certainly much better than, they have an opportunity to, certainly challenge Oklahoma and be in the same conversation that Oklahoma's in right now.
There you have it from Jason Ray. You see it on the banner, lastwordoncollegefootball.com. Please check out his work and everybody else there over on Last Word. All right, Jason, appreciate you stopping by as always. Enjoy that we do this each and every week, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.